Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Down to Earth. My name is Subhadra Das. I don't see any reason why it should be surprising that I'm a stand-up comedian. I'm as funny, arguably funnier than the next person. However, sorry, we had not seen that film before. Generally need to issue a trigger warning if there's going to be an image of Margaret Thatcher anywhere in a thing. So for those of you who did see my face, I apologize. Right. I am a science historian. It is my honor and my privilege this evening to chair the conversation with this panel. Before we do that, there is a story that I wanted to share with you. In fact, it's a story that was shared with me at an event fairly dissimilar to this one, run at the Union Chapel about a month ago by an organization called Choose Love. For those of you who don't know them, they are an organization who specialize in getting money to refugees and displaced peoples all around the world. I recommend you look them up. And in what was a cavalcade, a star-studded, even not quite as star-studded as we have this evening, to be fair. But among the speakers that evening was the writer Elif Shafak. And she shared a story with the room. This is the thing about being a science historian, is that you can never take a day off, right? And the story she shared with the room was one I felt like I immediately wanted to share with you. She spoke about some of the most displaced people in the world, the Yazidis, who I know that she will have done research, and some of whose stories she tells in her new book, which is called There Are Rivers in the Sky. This is the story she told. In the month of April, Yazidi grandmothers tell their grandchildren not to play too roughly outside. They say, don't be too boisterous and do not stomp on the earth. And when their grandchildren ask them why, the answer is, as everyone really should know, that in the month of April, the earth is pregnant. Those are the sorts of stories that you don't normally get in a scientific institution. But, and I hope my panel will also agree, I feel that those are the stories and those are the approaches to the natural world around us that are fundamental to how we need to be working with the earth and understanding where we are. So I hope you will feel like that was an appropriate frame for this conversation. They didn't know it was coming, but they are very amenable. Let me please introduce you to our lovely panel. First of all, we have Professor Martin Bell, who is Professor of Archaeological Science at the University of Reading. His research combines the contribution which archaeology makes to an understanding of environmental change on the wide range of timescales. And please, can we give some proper respect? Because we know an archaeologist when we see them because of the socks and sandals combination. And we give proper respect to this. Okay, thank you. Next is Professor Melissa Leach, who is Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Social anthropologists don't have such a strong sandal game. But nonetheless, we are grateful for her being here. She is Executive Director also of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and her extensive interdisciplinary research and publications span sustainability, transformations, forest and agriculture, food and health systems. There's a lot of things here, actually. We're going to be talking about all of those. Other important thing is that Melissa, along with her husband, is the co-author of a book called Nature Kind. We're going to be talking a bit more about that. If you haven't bought it already, it's available for sale everywhere where you can buy books. You should buy it. Yeah. Finally, we have Merlin Sheldrake, who is I always thought I knew how to pronounce this word until I was on a stage in front of you all. It is fungal, isn't it, as opposed to fungal? We're not going to do that.
Fungal.
Thank you so much.
Well, some people say fungi, and I always say, oh, you should say fungal then. And they say that fungal doesn't
This is a good high watermark as to have. Thank you for that. Apologies for the existential crisis in the middle of your introduction. For those of you who don't know, he is the author of Entangled Life, how there we go again. How fungi made our worlds change our minds, and shape our futures. Your book's not doing too badly, I feel. I don't feel the need to plug it quite so strongly, but it is an excellent book. This is only professional jealousy, because a friend of mine came up to me and said that Merlin Sheldrake's book about fungal life was the best science book she has ever read, which is really harsh, because I wrote those too. But anyway, I've got her number later if you are interested. But we're not here tonight we are here tonight to build friendships, but we're also here to have a conversation around the subject of soil. Now, admittedly, when the British Academy calls, you say yes. That is why we are here. But when they say we want you to come and talk for an evening about soil, I'm a failed archaeologist, as I have told you previously. But soil is an interesting one because soil is the thing that is everywhere and it is almost nowhere at the same time. It is the thing that is under our feet. It is the thing that we try to clean out from under our fingernails if we've been gardening. It is the thing that we might have negative associations with. Soil is not that far away from the word spoil. And it's not that far away from thinking about, oh, that's on my jumper now, and that's going to be annoying. But soil, as we are going to find out, is so much more. So can I ask you all as a starting question, what is soil? What does it mean to you? What are some of the misconceptions people might have about it? And why is it an important thing to be talking about? So, Martin, can we come to you first? Soil is your life, you work in it.
Yes, the soils that are the result of the interaction, really, between the mineral material, the lithosphere, the organic material from plants and animals, the atmosphere, and the hydrosphere. And the really key point is that it's an intimate combination of the organic and the mineral. And it's really a living entity. I think that's the important point to get across, really, that it's a living entity which is precious and must be protected and husbanded really carefully.
So yes, soils are living, soils are life, but soils are also our kin. Your Yazidi example, soils were mother. If you live in the Andes, your soil is Pachamama, it is Mother Earth. But I think our soils are always our kin. We relate to them, and we relate to the many, many living processes that are of animals and plants and all kinds of matter underneath our feet. And I think a common misconception is that even if we understand soils as living, one assumes that to be natural. And we think that people only degrade soils, and then you have to you kill them and have to compensate by adding chemicals, fertilizers, and so on. Whereas actually, there are so many examples where people nurture soils, they enrich them, they enable them to be more lively and fuller of biological life, rather than the other way around.
Thank you. Merlin?
I love so much what you've both said. I really don't know that I can add much more, but just to, I think about soils as being they're home to more than half of the planet's species. So there's more life in terms of species happening underground in the soils than there is above ground. And I also think about soils as, if one wants to use the metaphor of an organism, say the planet is an organism, the soils are one of the organs of that organism, and play such vital parts in the life of that organism that it couldn't do without them.
I think what's really poignant here is the fact that you all talk about soils in the plural.
Yeah.
And I think that's something I'm going to be taking away with this as well, because there's clearly a multiplicity of a universe that is happening there that we do certainly take for granted. We're going to talk about that more, but perhaps we're not even as aware of as we could be. The arc of how we're going to talk about soils this evening is a chronological one. We're going to go all the way back, and we're going to come to the present day, and we're also going to pontificate, promulgate about what might happen in the future. And it's important. It will become very clear why it's important we think about it. But first of all, Martin, I'm going to come to you. It's important that we understand how we got to where we are in terms of the soils that surround us, that depend on us. From what I can remember from the one archaeobotany lecture on my undergraduate course, was that 98% of the British Isles, in terms of the landscape, are the result of human intervention. So it may be that we have a notion that there are many wild and untouched natural landscapes, but in point of fact, humans have been interacting with soils and with the soil for centuries and for millennia. What can archaeological and also historical records tell us about how humans have interacted with soils over time?
I think the key point there is really the evidence that we get about soil history from looking at buried soils. Let's take a soil that's buried under a Bronze Age or a Neolithic burial mound. That tells us about the past history of that soil. And nearly all the soils, not just in the British Isles, but pretty well worldwide really, are the result of long histories of human activity. They're in a way moulded by the history of activity that's affected them. So one of the things that archaeologists and geoarchaeologists like myself are doing are trying to untangle that history of the soil and find out how the soils that we have today actually came about as a result of earlier forms of land use. Take the heathland soils of the British Isles, for instance. Those areas were once quite wooded, but during the Bronze Age, intensive grazing resulted in the loss of trees over time and the development of an impoverished heathland soil, which is really the result of a sort of extractive way of life where grazing animals and cutting vegetable material and moving it to settlements has resulted in a concentration of nutrition around settlements and an impoverishment of the wider heathland landscape and its soils.
Okay, so in that, so I think just so that I can get a picture of this, yeah, the land doesn't just stay flat the whole time. When archaeologists dig, what they are digging through is hundreds of years of soil that has built up. This was one thing I never did get my head around in terms of my archaeology degree. Dug plenty of holes, found plenty of things and people. But the notion that the Anglo-Saxon cemetery that I was excavating was somehow 2 meters down. In terms of that process of things coming up and things changing over time, how can we understand that soil builds up and is something that changes over time?
I think the key point there really is that we've got build-up of soil in hollows and valleys, but the erosion and reduction of soil on the slope. And a lot of my research has been looking at those areas of soil build-up, particularly in valleys, in order to try and read the history of that soil. And in parts of Britain, for instance, you start off with in the Neolithic period, for instance, in a soil that's very rich in earth and fertile, very attractive to the first farmers, and that through time, as erosion and agriculture proceeds, so that soil thins. You get the build-up of soil in some areas, as you describe, but in other areas, you're ending up with a soil that is far thinner than the woodland soil that you would have started off with in the earlier part of the post-glacial period.
And that's happening across the whole... Well, let's take the British Isles as an example. That's happening across the whole of the British Isles. It's not simply the case... I don't know why I've got a picture of the British Isles as if it's something like a sandcastle that a child has built, and it's only the things around the edge that get worn off. The wearing is happening everywhere.
I think that's where the concept of soils in the plural comes, because actually you've got very different soil histories in the chalk downland where I work, where the soils have dramatically thinned, the heathlands that I described, where you get the development of podsols, or the moorland areas where peat development takes place and creates the moorlands that we have today.
In terms of historically, then, how have people dealt with this challenge, both in terms of deep history, in terms of archaeological history, but also more recent history? This is something people have noticed, presumably.
I think there's a great deal that we can learn from the way in which people looked after these landscapes in the past. Terracing is one obvious example over many areas of Europe, Mediterranean and beyond, but also traditional systems of manuring, small fields, the use of various forms of soil improvement, and indeed husbanding the soil by using traditional agricultural methods in a way that I think we've largely forgotten about in today's industrial farming systems.
Does that ring a bell with both of you, Melissa, Merlin? What, we've forgotten a lot?
Well, I was going to turn to some of the other parts of the world that we can learn from. So I think we've forgotten a lot in the UK. If one even goes back a few generations, I mean, if I talk to my mother-in-law, who grew up farming in East Anglia, about soils, she will remember a time when the soil was rich, one would smell it, one would feel it. It was very, very different to the soils which are now the result of decades of chemical applications and impoverishments. But I wanted to kind of move to the other side of the world, really, around archaeology, to the Amazon, where, again, we've got a world where there's been, I think, some quite serious misconceptions about soils. And there, under those high rainforests, it had always been thought that soils themselves were actually quite poor. And the reason you get rainforest is that there's a lot of very rapid nutrient cycling in the trees. And therefore, it was believed that prior to European conquest, where epidemics, as we know, wiped out many, many millions of people, the soils, the land could only support maybe a few hunter-gatherers wandering around. And what archaeology in the Amazon has shown is that actually populations there, so prior to 500 years ago, were enriching soils through the deposition of wastes, of fish bones, of char from cooking fires. And so that quite quickly over time, where people lived, soils would become deep and rich and dark. So in a way, the opposite of a history of humans only create decline. This was people enriching soils. And of course, once we understand soil history differently, we also understand human history differently. And we can begin to appreciate how in those regions there were vast populations in settled cities and states. And we can appreciate that the decline and the violence and the epidemics were even more serious than we know them to be. So soil history tells us about human history and vice versa.
Absolutely. Mel, is there anything you want to add to that at this point?
I totally agree with all of that. That humans are co-authors of soils, as are so many other organisms. And that we're often co-authors because we work together with other organisms, often explicitly, to create soils. There's a great episode in a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries by a man called King, and he wrote it in 1911, and he talks about walking into a city in China, I can't remember which, but that on the other side of the road, farmers or their families were competing for travelers to come and use their toilet, not their neighbor's toilet, because the feces was of such value. So in this case, you have the human co-authoring with the human that they're soliciting feces from, but it often to non-humans as well. But this is a very active process. You can imagine the theatrical moment, like walking down this road, and everyone, I think it would be a great opera in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Just to think of all the wealth we are literally flushing away. This reminds me of indigenous approaches to land management in Australia, for example. So Bill Gammage, in his book, The Greatest Estate on Earth, talks about first Australians, and what they do is they do strategic burning of plants and trees in order to do, I think there is a soil enrichment aspect involved in there as well, but also a very clever method of getting your prey to come to you. So even a passive system of hunting. Why chase after animals if you can bring them to you?
Exactly.
And I think we can talk about terracing, and we can talk about these methods of soil enrichment and landscape management. But the planet that we live on now is hugely exploited within a system of extractive capitalism. The models in which people think about how we need to get the best out of the soil are models to do with fertilizer. And those are, again, extractive processes in themselves as well. It is hugely challenging to try to think about, because it's a mindset change that needs to happen, but also a concern about how do we keep feeding people in the absence of these methods that do seem very destructive. Melissa, I'm looking at you on this one. Like, can you just save the planet for us in a really quick? They didn't know I was going to ask this, by the way. This wasn't on the script.
Well,
but I think it's important.
yeah. Okay, there's a lot in there. I mean, I think the dominant models of capitalist agriculture, and I would take that broader to think about the industrial food system that is locked into those capitalist models, is deeply depleting of soils. It relies on soils, it treats soils as if they were dead, and then applies a kind of banking model to the way soils are conceptualized. So you can kind of invest in them with with chemical fertilizers and so on and deplete them. And it's a kind of in and out, as if a soil was a kind of bank in a way.
Or a closed system.
Yeah, as opposed to a kind of model of living soils. And there are many examples of practices and ways of living with soil that can feed people and sustain life and sustain human life and plant life at the same time. And I would point particularly to agroecology as the exemplar here. We talk a lot about regenerative farming. I'm quite wary of the use of that term because it describes a lot of practices that sometimes amount to not very much, or they're a greenwashing label for what still becomes quite
For people who don't know
depleting.
what greenwashing is, can we get a quick definition?
Well,
there?
greenwashing would be where you've got often a corporation or an agribusiness firm that says, we're doing regenerative farming, and maybe you've added one little technique on top of what's essentially still a depleting model.
Okay.
Agroecological practices are a bit different because, as well, there are a set of principles which are now well recognized. They're scientifically validated. They rest on a combination of often indigenous and local knowledge and scientific knowledge. Soil health is one of those principles, and the soil health principle is all about working with organic matter and enhancing biological diversity in soils. But importantly, it sits alongside other principles, which are around listening to smallholders, creating equity in your food systems, having short market chains, thinking about economic diversity. So basically, our soils sit within much wider systemic processes, and we need to move beyond those which have driven industrial models.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer to a question you didn't know was coming, so I really appreciate it. This is an important point about the fact that soils are not dead things, even though by and large we treat them as dead things. Yeah. They are, to coin a title of a book, entangled life. Merlin, can you build us a greater picture here of how soils are not dead things?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think much of modern agriculture grew up in a time when, a bit like much of modern medicine, when small organisms, microbes, were thought of as parasites or pathogens. The word symbiosis was brought into biology in the late 19th century to describe a world where you could have the intimate sharing of bodily space between one organism and smaller organisms, but without calling them parasites or pathogens. And that word symbiosis did a lot for the way that we see the world, because it was possible to talk about coexistence in a way that wasn't parasitic or pathogenic. And so microbes on the human body were thought of as agents of disease. Microbes in the soil, all too often, thought of as agents of disease, things to be killed or at best ignored. And so the idea of a living soil, like the idea of a living microbial us, is a more modern place to have arrived, and it's often through new techniques like DNA sequencing, or just looking with less bigoted eyes. For example, armed with the word symbiosis that doesn't force you to judge the relationship that you're trying to understand. So soils are living places. Now, this would not have come as news to 99.9% of traditional human societies. I make up that number, but I'm confident that an overwhelming majority of traditional human societies in the present and the past would not have thought of the soils as dead places, because every piece of evidence that you can see with your own unaided senses will tell you the opposite. This is where life comes from. This is where life springs from. This is where life goes to when you die. Yeah. This is a place where it seems like a remarkable thing for the modern sciences to have forgotten and then rediscovered. But I think that idea that modern scientists haven't discovered this, but are remembering something that we have long known, is the key point, that soils are alive, soils are made by living organisms, soils are home to living organisms.
And I think that's very poignant, because you all live and work with soils as well. As an archaeologist, Martin, is there a difference in the way that you've conceived of the soils that you've been digging over the course of your career? Do you view it differently from how you started out, maybe? Slightly
Yes,
leading
I
question.
think, I mean, one problem has often been that archaeologists tend to regard soil as sediment, you know, the dirt that you dig through in order to get at stuff, and really coming to understand that it's a living entity and that it's a result of particular ways of life that have built up in an intimate way in partnership with landscapes and different forms of agriculture and so on, is something that one gradually realises and comes to see that there's been this long history of change, really, as the soils of today have evolved from the largely much deeper woodland soils that would have originally have existed. But I think one thing that I've come to appreciate more and more, really, is how the way that people use agricultural landscapes is very much related to the local community and the ways of life of particular villages and people's attitudes to nature and the environment and so on. It's all part of a really important package. And I think that link between as it were, the scientific and the social is something that is increasingly recognised, really, by archaeologists and the way they approach what may seem to be the sort of mineral material of the soil.
I can see you both nodding along there, you particularly, Merlin. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the, I was chairing a panel in the House of Commons recently with a lot of different experts there to talk about soil health. And one of the points that became clear through this conversation was that this subject of soil was it's obviously a very important subject, but this was a way that different parts of science and society could come together in one room and have a conversation with each other. And it was actually hard for us to think of other subjects that could have that same hub-like effect. And it was very pronounced, and was one of the ways that, one of the things I took away from that was that thinking about the health of the soil can actually help us heal ourselves in our fractured and ruptured and divided societies.
That's very profound, Melissa, yeah? This again ring bells with your research and your experiences of people who work with soils around the world.
No, it does. I mean, I think my own kind of apprenticeship to coming to understand soils and what they meant actually probably had started in West Africa, where I'd worked as a social anthropologist with farmers, with men and women who were completely convinced. I mean, the women would say things like, well, God made the soil, but we made it fertile. And so just by living in those settlements, we're talking here about Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, where it was just part of everyday life that you'd throw the waste of your cooking fire, you'd take your kids to poo behind your house. Gradually, over time, these rich black soils would build up very, very quickly and would be very different from the kind of background soils, which tended to be hard and lateritic and red. And I think what I came to realize was not so much that people were consciously kind of investing in and looking at and managing their soils, but just that there was almost an inevitability, almost a lack of intentionality. Where you have people and human settlement, soils would become richer, and then there were kind of modes of understanding which just really linked the notion of life going on well in the human world, ideas about fertility, linked through notions of colour. So in those areas, culturally, fertility is linked with blackness and oiliness, and people would describe the soils that became rich as oily, and they were very dark. And then there was this historical sense that the land of an old settlement, were often you'd sometimes move your village to be nearer the road or for economic reasons, and those old spots were places of high fertility and high value, where your ancestors had lived, and people would live with those and protect them. So I think, that was my apprenticeship of learning to live soils in a kind of culture that was initially unfamiliar, but then one became embedded in that culture, and it was a more than human culture that involved the non-human as well.
I think, yes, that's a really important point as well, is understanding non-human forms of life, and the fact that for a long time we have considered ourselves exceptional in ways that are probably really quite unhelpful.
Yeah.
And that point that you make about language is a really important one as well. I have to say, so when I first encountered those ideas of dark or black soils, my hackles are raised immediately as someone who writes about the history of race science and who understands the history of how people with darker skin have been dehumanized, deemed uncivilized, their stories have been lost on this account. I react negatively against those words. But I can see from the ways that you talk about them in this context that there is a richness and there's a positivity that we can gain from here as well.
Well, I think, there's a positivity, but there's also a reality of the way that those colours are perceived, and there are black soils and there are red soils, and people understand the differences between them. But coming on to language, that's what James and I have recently been reflecting on in the book you mentioned, Nature Kind, because
available where you can buy books. I've mentioned that you can buy the book.
No,
Nature Kind.
I'm not.
I know you're not. I am. That's fine.
There's
a difference.
But that was making the probably slightly odd claim that actually our relations with soils are not just lively; they are also conversational. And it may be a bit odd to say we have a conversation with a soil. But that we make the case that is actually true, and that you have a lot of meaningful communication happening underground, and it is amongst the fungi and the worms and the micro and the macroorganisms and the plant matter. But we as people can't plumb the depths of what's going on. We've now got nice technologies. You can stick probes in the soil and pick up that it's lively because there's sort of bioacoustics. But basically, we don't have to know.
Bioacoustics?
Bioacoustics is soundscapes and using technological microphones to pick up on liveliness underneath the ground.
I'm fairly open-minded, but this one is an interesting one.
Call me out. So, but that's not where I'm going. What the point I wanted to make is that we don't need to know all about the meaningful communication that the organisms underground are engaged in. As people, we can pick up on what we call in the book meta signs, the bigger kind of indicators, which kind of sort of give a clue as to what's happening. And soil colour, I think, is one of those. And for certainly those West African farmers, that difference between black and red is a kind of meta sign. Other signs that we might pick up on might be whether there are worms or not. Mm-hmm. Or if you're a West African farmer, you might go, okay, there are termite mounds here, which somehow tells us a lot about what's going on underneath, even if we don't know it. But worms, too, are a kind of meta sign of a lot of the stuff that's happening underground, which is meaningful. But we don't need to know the detail.
Absolutely. Archaeologists probably responsible for the death of more earthworms as non-farmers in this country, I would suggest. I killed a lot of them. Not deliberately, it's like they get in the way of the trowel. But just goes to demonstrate the kind of archaeology I was doing. In terms of those living landscapes as well, Martin, like I wonder, are there, I'm trying to find a good way to get this question out. Are there certain orthodoxies in how we have approached understanding ancient civilizations and societies through soils that, perhaps can confound some more modern ideas? I'm trying to work out, do we misconceive of ancient peoples in certain ways in which soils can help enlighten us?
Well, I think it's a very challenging area, really, because for a long time there's been the assumption that some civilizations collapsed because of massive soil erosion, and certainly I think there probably are cases where that has happened, but it can all too easily seem to be an excuse, really, and a way of ignoring the social inequality, for instance, which is quite often a much greater reason for the collapse of those particular civilizations. So I would say it's what we're trying to achieve is really a balanced understanding of the relationship between the people, their soils and their landscape, rather than trying to explain major periods of social change by catastrophic soil erosion or indeed climate change, or volcanism. These are other processes that people have tended to turn to rather than reflecting more deeply on the social reasons for major changes.
So whenever I think again about these entanglements, I'm going to come to you, Merlin, because it's the idea of we do exist, whether we are in symbiotic relationship, whether we are the parasite, we can start to use soils as a way in which to model perhaps societies better in terms of being able to understand our intrinsic connectedness. I know that you write very eloquently about the wood wide web, and a colleague of mine who is based out of UCL Science and Technology Studies runs a program called Fungi Futures, which is getting people to simply go and walk in nature, in landscapes, to observe what they can, and also to look at, well, it's mushrooms particularly, which is not the whole of fungi, I appreciate, but to be able to understand the connectedness of life as a means of trying to understand greater connectedness between people. Is that a bit woo? Is that a bit hippie? Has that opportunity gone? Are we just too far gone as a society to remember that we are human beings who are connected to each other?
I think we know we're connected to each other. There are so many ways that we know this. I mean, loneliness is an epidemic that kills people, lots of people. And you don't have to know about the studies of loneliness to be someone who's being killed by loneliness. That's something that you just know and it kills you, or it can kill you. So I think there's lots of ways that our insistence on individuality, the way that we create societies and social situations and social structures and networks of care and responsibility, the way that we design our collective lives today in many parts of the world, are done in such a way that we don't really prioritize those relationships, often because they're invisible, and they're relationships of care and love and kin and kinship, and those things are hard to measure, and they're often hard to see. And so, yes, I think there's lots of ways that we can change the way we do things to better reflect our connectedness and better let ourselves see that we have always been connected, not just with other humans, but with the living world more generally. Fungi can be helpful because they form networks of connection between parts of themselves and between other organisms. And so they demonstrate very clearly, they kind of embody this principle, this connective principle of ecology. So I find them helpful to think with. I don't think that we necessarily want to always model ourselves on being fungi. It's a kingdom of life. There are lots of ways to be a fungus, and some fungi behave in ways that I would never want to behave. So there's always a risk in naturalizing our behavior or seeking to model our behavior on the behaviors we find in the living world. But in terms of the way that they are networks, the way that they make it impossible to forget the connectedness of the living world, and the way that they are agents of transformation always, in the way that they are so vitally embedded in the biogeochemical cycles, you know, the rivers in the sky, the pulses and emanations of nutrients, the carbon cycle, so many things. I think they can help us remember that we have always been connected.
I think that's really beautiful. That philosophy of the connectedness of human and non-human kind is important. Can we think about it in more practical terms? We are now in a time of climate crisis. The clock is ticking. We used to be concerned about the doomsday clock, which was whether or not we were going to end in a nuclear winter. Turns out we don't need to worry about a nuclear winter because the planet is in bigger trouble, even without our intervention in that sense. And I'm going to open this up to all of you as well, but what are the ways in which understanding our relationship with soils can help us to come up with practical ways to understand and combat climate crisis? The reason I'm asking this question, by the way, is that some of you may have heard arguments along the lines of the planet has experienced extremes in climate previously. There has been soil erosion previously. The planet will continue to survive whether we are here or not. And those are the kind of arguments that are made by people who are stashing away their money so that they can go and live on other planets and leave the rest of us behind. So if you have heard those arguments previously, please be under no misapprehension that they are not helpful. Can I turn to the panel for more helpful arguments?
I mean, I sometimes think those arguments are not helpful as arguments, but they're helpful facts to put on the table, because I think looking at how those previous moments of big transformation on the planet have played out can help us when we're thinking about riding out this big moment of transformation, which is underway. So what happened then in these transformative moments that we can learn from? And some of the things we can learn from, one of the ways, I think about this, I study these kinds of fungi. I would mention this, but one of these big moments of transformation actually was partially caused by mycorrhizal fungi, which live in symbiosis with plants. They live in and around their roots. Plants feed these underground fungal partners with carbon compounds, like fats and sugars that they've made in photosynthesis. So they're pulling carbon out of the air, they're turning it into chemicals, like fats and sugars. They then send those down and they power their lives with it, but they also exchange it with their fungal partners, and their fungal partners are living in the soil, and they're very good in the soil. They can navigate the labyrinth of the soil, they're metabolically ingenious, they can forage for nutrients in the way that plants can't. So they provide nutrients to the plant provides carbon compounds to the fungi. And what this means is that lots of carbon ends up in the soil, where it's stabilized by these fungi, where these fungi are able to turn it around and power the big ecosystems of the soil. But it also means that carbon is pulled out of the atmosphere. And when this relationship evolved around 450 million years ago, it became such a wild success that plants boomed, grew all across the planet, and they pulled so much carbon out of the atmosphere that it triggered a period of global freezing called the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse. And so this was a dramatic moment that went in the other direction to the one that we're facing now. But at this time, maybe it would be helpful to remember this very, very powerful and successful version of carbon capture and storage, which has transformed the planet many times over. And a lot of the work I do with the Society for the Protection of Underground Networks is to think about exactly how to do that, and in detail how to do that. So I agree with you, those arguments are usually red flags, but I do like thinking about change.
Yeah.
Thank you for your generosity. It's not one that I share, but I'm glad that other people are willing to do that work.
Yeah.
Melissa, you've got something to say?
Yeah, I mean, that's just such a great story, and does remind us that transformation happens and really big changes do happen, but also reminds us of the processes through which carbon, which is our current problem, is deeply interrelated with what is going on in soils. And of course, this offers potentials now in current climate predicaments for thinking about ways of doing carbon capture which don't rely on geoengineering solutions or bubbles underground or under the sea, but actually enable us
Which is where we all might end up living.
Which is where we might all end up living. But in the meantime, we can nurture and protect and enrich and encourage these living worlds of soil and vegetation, which are drawing down carbon from the atmosphere and keeping it in place and cycling it under the ground and over the ground. And also look to value the people and the territories of life, to use the phrase that indigenous groups would often claim, who are central to this and have been nurturing and protecting these kinds of places, which are going to be more and more critical to us into the future. Yeah.
I think you do talk about this in your book, available to buy wherever you buy books, that there is this idea about how there is a complexity involved in how we advocate for nature, because to a certain degree that can perpetuate this us as something separate from nature point of view.
Yeah.
But there also have been, in plenty of parts of the world, many indigenous activists who do their best to say, we need to protect our rainforests, we need to protect our landscapes. And so this is a very fundamental part for how we can all move forward as a species.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering now about is, in our day-to-day lives, for everyone here, like when we go, it's really clean in here. I don't know whether you've noticed. If any kind of element of soils were to make their way into the building, they'll be swept away, they'll be cleaned away. I remember a friend of mine worked on excavation in Pompeii. The story is primarily just for you, Martin, but just so you know. And she was Italian. That's why she got to work in Pompeii. And for those of you who don't know, Pompeii, the ancient city that was buried under pyroclastic cloud, so the people died in the ash, which means that archaeologists have to excavate ash, which means that you end up covered in ash. And her mother, who was my friend's mother, who was this very fancy lady from Milan, came to visit and said, "This is very interesting, but next time try and find a cleaner excavation to work on." I don't know whether if you can recommend one, let me know one about that later. What I'm trying to say is, we live pristine lives in ways so that soils particularly are things that are highly orchestrated. We may encounter them if we're lucky enough to have a garden, if we are houseplant inclined, but they exist at a distance from us in our modern world. How we can try and, what are the ways in which we can try to bridge that gap? What can all the people in this room and the people at home and in other rooms, what can they do to bridge the gap that we have made between ourselves and our soils?
I think one simple answer is compost, actually. You know, that's the way to really learn how the organic and the mineral combine together and what wonderful results you can produce if you've got a really successful compost heap.
For those of us that live in flats?
Yeah, I would say, compost, love your worms and stop chopping them in half.
Again, it's not deliberate. They get in the way of the trowel is what happens.
But I think also just get curious. Go and find a couple of handfuls of soil and just examine, touch, feel, smell. In this kind of multi-sensory way.
The British Academy does not eat don't touch it, don't
and
eat
experience what's there and actually remember. I think as children, until we get educated into a school and scientific mindset, we have that more connected kind of way of relating to soil. We dig about in it. Kids love to do it.
Disgust is a learned emotion.
Let's all be children again and play and get interested and curious.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think just handling soil, going out. So if you go for a walk in the park, then you're walking around in a soily place, and you can put your hands in the soil. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just take off some leaf litter and you can put your hands on the soil. And in doing so, you can remember all the ways that we push ourselves away from the soil. Leaf litter, I've got a whole list of I came up with this with colleagues on a field trip. All the ways, all the sayings and idioms that we have that make the soil bad. You're grounded, don't be a stick in the mud. I've got a whole list of them. It's amazing how many there are. So part of connecting with soil, I think, is remembering how we are kept away from it, both in the languages and ideas which are a currency for us, and also with the walls and the doors that we build for ourselves.
Yeah. There is, again, language is very interesting in this account because there is a certain insidiousness in how that language works. Another word for soil is dirt, and things that have got dirt on them are dirty. And that can apply not only to things but to people too. So it is endemic in the ways in which we think about the world. Perhaps what's required here is a soil positivity. Yeah. Should we just, that's ours now? We've coined that. So soil positivity,
soil positivity, TM. It's a movement.
It is. Yeah. Entirely. I think we are slightly, in the interests of, we're slightly ahead of time in how we've gone through questions, some of which were prepared and some of which weren't. Well done for rolling with the unprepared ones. I think I'm going to open up the Q&A a teeny bit earlier. I don't think we're going to get in trouble for doing that. I can see that some of you are eager immediately. The way that the Q&A works is if you have something that you would like to ask our panel, do ask them. Wait for the microphone to come to you before you start asking. And if you have something to tell them, by all means tell someone else. So we've got people chomping at the bit here. So if you could just wait for the microphone to come to you. And this is good, excellent modelling. Good waiting for microphone. Thank you for your question.
Is this on?
We can hear you.
Merlin mentioned earlier the farmers of 40 centuries and the toilet and the humanure. And that always strikes me as being an amazing idea, But I wonder how the panel will react to the problems nowadays with antibiotics and drugs and other things going into the human manure that seem like a big impediment to it being a useful addition of organic matter back to the soil.
Forgive me for what I'm about to say, but so shit ain't what it used to be. Not a straightforward question, certainly one I am ill-equipped to answer. Thank you for your question. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Well, it's already spread on fields in large quantities, and it's done so after being taken through sewage treatment facilities, which are not composting facilities. And so I think there would be more artful and scientific ways to handle the waste, which is already ending up on our fields. And it's a huge problem, these additions, these persistent chemicals, the hormones, the antibiotics, all the various drugs, the microplastics. And if that process was more carefully curated, I'm sure we'd get a better handle on it. But it's a wicked problem. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this problem that I can see is that often when we're buried, we're the last little while where our bodies are on Earth, if one is going to be buried, we're filled with embalming fluids. And so we become, if we weren't already, a pollutant, even more of a pollutant that won't break down in the soil. You know, our very selves, our material selves.
Actually, that is one. This is along with soil positivity, death positivity is another thing that I'm quite big on. And to really genuinely, one thing every single person in this room can do is to make sure that you are just buried as bare. If you insist on being buried, I insist on being burnt. But if you insist on being buried, please be buried as minimally as is humanly possible. And there are places that you can go who can help with that process. The more of us that do it, the better it will be for everyone altogether. I'm coming at that from a slightly different angle. But yeah, certainly it is the case that our waste ends up in our waterways in ways that we do not sanction and are being made to pay for. So certainly, if it can be better managed, things will be better managed. Thank you. Anyone else want to talk about that before we move on to the next one?
Just sorry, very, very quickly. I think the better management, in the simplest terms, is to treat our waste not as waste, but as the stuff of life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's inherent again in the language. Yeah. Thank you. And they're very keen at the front. Excellent, as it should be. Thank you for waiting for the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Kevin. My background is in AI. I run an AI research company. And I haven't told my co-founder yet, but I am returning to university to start a master's in soil science. And my question to the panel is, do you have any word of advice for someone venturing into this field?
What an excellent question. Immediate thumbs up from you.
Well, do it, I think, is the key message, because soil science is a subject that's rather faded in British universities. It's been neglected by governments. I think at last, in the 25-year environment strategy, there is recognition by politicians that it's something we need to take very seriously, but I'm not at all convinced that they're entirely committed to that. You know, their attention tends to move on to other things, and that vital research and advice to the farming community is all important. 40 years ago, we had something called the Soil Survey that was giving free advice to farmers on how to husband their land carefully. And that, of course, was commercialised. Now they have to pay for that advice, pay fees and so on. And inevitably, you know, only those that are rich can afford to pay for it, and by and large those aren't the ones that are getting the advice anyway. They think they know what they're doing. So I think you've got a great future ahead of you, and you're much needed.
Yeah.
Oh, that's warm. Shall we add to that?
Well, I would just add, I mean, I'm sure you have, but pick your course carefully, because soil science has changed an awful lot. And you want to make sure you've got soil ecology in there, you're understanding fungi, you're understanding soils as living, and I would add in some history of science, history of soil science into the mix. And if it's not being formally taught, read around the edge of it.
Completely agree. Soil touches, as we've said, so many aspects of our lives that you could study it from so many different points of view. You could study it as a dead geophysical space, you could study it as an ecological place, you could study it as an anthropological place. So to find your way in as broadly as possible, that's what I would do.
Yeah.
There are a couple of books that you can buy ahead of your reading. Martin, I haven't asked you if you've written any books. Are there any books of yours I can plug while we're up here? No?
There are none that are suitable to plug.
Okay, but potentially for someone who's about to do a course. Anyway, come back to us. Read widely, I think, is an excellent piece of advice. Any more questions in the room? Can we come to this person here first and then the one behind them, please?
I was just wondering what makes rich soils dark?
Melissa, that's one for you.
What makes rich soil dark? Well, it's going to be a combination of organic matter, and also, in the case of the anthropogenic dark earths, the human-made dark earths that I was talking about earlier, it's quite a lot of char from cooking, from fires, from waste processing, and that includes black carbon. So the soils that are dark also tend to be very, very carbon rich. So it's a mixture of those things, really. But Merlin is a much more of a soil scientist than me and could add to this.
I totally agree with what you said.
Yeah. So the dark soils, the rich soils are lived soils, are lived and living, lived on and living soils.
Yeah.
Not just by humans, I mean peaty soils also.
Yeah, peaty, exactly.
Those are dead plants and moss.
Yeah. So there are different chemical and biological processes which will have results in terms of colour, and humans get involved in them in different ways, I think.
Just living up on layers. There's one question just behind you, but I've seen you, so we're going to come to you next. Yeah.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for everything you said so far. It's been absolutely fascinating. Talking about, you mentioned antiseptic lives that we're living and wanting to feel more connected to the soil, etc. I was thinking, other than wanting to be connected to nature, generally speaking, are there health or physical benefits of being closer to soil? Full disclosure, I'm not a scientist, but as in that exposure to the microbes within soil and being around it in that way, as in yet another incentive for people to be closer to soil specifically.
I'll preface that with no one on the panel is a medical doctor, but nonetheless, I think we can still speak to this.
I was just actually speaking to someone, a Finnish scientist, who is really transforming the way that schools are being built and designed in Finland. And his main argument to persuade the government about that are the many studies that have been done there to do with physical and mental health and soil chemicals. So this is this was in his hands. This was a strong enough case to redesign lived and played in environments. So there is a literature.
Cool. And does anyone else want to speak to that one? Really? I mean, just from your own personal experience as well, is there something? What can we say about an archaeologist's life, for example?
I think there are two answers in a way to that question. One is a soil scientist that I worked with for years who always said to me, if you knew what was in this soil, you would never let it anywhere near your mouth. I often eat soil in order to assess
the British Academy does not endorse your eating of soil outside of
its particle size, and I think there's general agreement among many people that it's a good thing to ingest a certain amount of dirt and microbes and so on in order to build up the resilience, really, and that's an area that needs more research, clearly, isn't it?
Yeah. As a species, we've made it this far, right? We've only been this clean for a relatively recent period of our history. Statistically speaking, there will be value in this. Just again to reiterate that no one here is a medical doctor.
Yeah. Actually, I would just add, I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, although I do know there are some medical doctors in this audience, but eating earth is part of traditional medicine in many parts of the world. I mean, for instance, in parts of East Africa where pregnant women consume the insides of termite mounds because there are minerals that are particularly valuable in that stage of pregnancy. So I think there are many, many instances where actually soils are also medicines.
There's unfortunately a very sad history of science story, which is that enslaved African women in the country that is now the United States that particular practice was pathologized, and that there is actually a medical condition called pica. They did not have that, but pica is the supposed appetite for non-nutritional
exactly
food or eating things. before I wander off. Can we come to the question that's been waiting patiently, and then I will come to the question that was outside the room. Thank you for your patience.
My question is, soil contamination is a really very important topic for the next 200 years, because according to me, agriculture is the first best invention of mankind. The second is internet. But now agriculture, when it was started at that time, I don't know how they realized that this soil is good to grow this particular crop without any technology or anything. But right now, if you have to safeguard the same soil, you have to make sure you have to regulate soil contamination laws globally altogether. Now, you did mention that capitalist farming drives the entire agriculture industry. Is there any framework being discussed very recently that soil contamination is a topic and we have to address in every nation and avoid using fertilizer, chemical-based pesticides, anything that will impact soil contamination? So is there any discussion happened globally on this?
I mean, I think there's plenty of discussion happening, and it's part of the growing and really valid critique of industrial farming models, which are based on kind of mining soils, replacing then what is lost from life with artificial chemicals, which in effect contaminate and kill soils. So there are plenty of arguments about alternatives to that and ways of working with living soils, but it needs to go along often with producing different kinds of crops, a greater diversity of crops, using different methods like rotating crops, intercropping. If we're going to move in those directions, we probably need to think a little bit differently about diet. We need to stop feeding quite so much of the cereals we produce to animals, and move towards diets which are more plant-based, so that we're actually consuming, using that cereal production for human consumption rather than animal consumption, consuming less meat. Then we need to think about some of the other aspects of the food system around who controls and owns the land, and who controls and owns the inputs. And I think if you want to pin the biggest problem of our current food systems, it's concentration. It's the fact that we've got a small handful of Titan-like, enormous agribusiness firms that are controlling and profiting from fertilizers, seeds, the machines, the technologies, the tractors, the digital technologies which are now powering large-scale farms. And this is what's pushing against the kinds of systems and ways of producing food which will protect and preserve and work with living soils. So that's a slightly long question to the answer of soil contamination. I think soil contamination is part of a much bigger set of food system challenges in a way.
Any regulations, policy framework?
You haven't got the microphone, I'm afraid. Sorry. Also, I'm mindful that there are other questions kind of coming. There's definitely other questions in the room. And we've also got another question online as well. Let's go for that one.
Yes, I've got one online question from Isla, who asks, what is the impact of even-aged forestry on soil health?
I don't even know what that is. Martin, you look like you did.
Well, we're talking about plantations, really, often single species plantations, which, generally speaking, I would say are not good for soil health. They tend to be coniferous plantations. Often the soil is severely damaged during the planting process, so there needs to be a very different form of forestry, I think, in our uplands, and one which is much more focused on trying to reduce the amount of runoff, for instance, from upland, woodland areas and so on. So far more ecologically focused approach to forestry, I would say, is a key part of that answer.
Thank you. We're starting to feel that already, by the way. You heard that penguins, not the bird, but the chocolate bar, have been decommissioned as chocolate. And that is a direct result of issues to do with farming in Western Africa, because of that's where the chocolate comes from. They're not able to produce the chocolate to that degree that they had been previously, because, there is overproduction and there is overstripping of these resources. I saw that there were questions on that side of the room at the back. I saw 2 hands up. I can't see all of them, so stick your hands well up. So right at the back, next to you, Kathleen, yep. And then we're going to work our way forwards. Thank you.
Hi, yeah. I just want to ask you about, for example, something like aquaponics and hydroponics.
We can't actually even hear you with the microphone
there,
sorry.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
That's a bit better.
All right.
Thank you.
I was just wanting to ask you about hydroponics, aquaponics, and the like. There's a lot of people who are talking about this as the savior of our food systems, like that's going to save the people in the cities, etc., in the future. But I'm a landscape architect, and I work also with roof gardens, landscapes on the roofs. And I was asked, where does the worms come from? What do they connect with, etc. I feel like there's a bit of a misunderstanding about where we should get our food from in all of that. And also with the green roofs in the cities, that's not exactly the proper environment that we should get. There's something called the urban greening factor that we have, sort of like a tick box exercise we have to do when we do our work. And we feel like that's not really proper landscapes because it's not in the ground.
So just to paraphrase.
Yeah, just to wrap that up, it's sort of like, what is your opinions about aquaponics and hydroponics and the kind of like all these alternative systems?
So the question is hydroponics going to save us? And also, how will we get the earth? Do we need to build like little lifts for the earthworms to get up to the roof gardens?
No.
Save us, science.
I don't know. No, you go.
I think one of the problems with hydroponics, clearly hydroponics works to grow tomatoes, it works to grow other highly valuable illegal cash crops in inside environments, in like abundantly. It's no question you can grow plants that way. But you're not necessarily giving, you're in control of what the plant gets. And one of the problems with, if you look at the history of cultivation and the history of soil and plant sciences, is that we don't really always know what the plant needs. When we think we do, we end up with something like modern agriculture, where we think about the soil as a substrate for N, P, and K that we apply synthetically from outside. There's more than that, it turns out. And we keep discovering that there's more than that. So in a world where we totally reverted to, or totally transformed our lives to a hydroponic system, I think there'd be a lot that we are missing out, because there's a lot we don't understand. And there's a lot of self-feeding and self-integrating that goes on with the plants that we depend on. And that we need to create the conditions for them to do what they do best, which might often involve communicating with other organisms. So unknown unknowns would be my summary answer.
Yeah. I'm just going to assume that I was correct about the lifts for worms. I think there were questions further forward. So this one here, and then, depending on time, you might be our last one. Thank you.
Hello. How do you view genetic systems engineering as part of the toolbox for healing soils, or do you see this as potentially a false narrative?
I think you were quite careful not to use the word genetic modification there. But yes, this is another aspect of technology that is available to us. Is there hope?
I can start on that. I think there are two particular issues there. One is that, a little bit like hydroponics, this is again about trying to put humans in control of systems and processes that are actually much more complex, much more uncertain, and where there are always going to be consequences that are unintended, and we don't quite know what the results will be. Whereas if we're working with living soils, we're in a much more uncertain world where we're adapting constantly. I think the other question, which is often in my mind about technology, is which humans, if these are human-controlled technologies, are actually in control. And there are many examples of innovations which are actually requiring large-scale capital inputs. They are of a kind of high-tech kind, and they tend to lead one down a path where you've got corporate control or certain elites controlling a process, which then rather works against the arguments that would merge, say, from agroecology, which are about respecting smallholders, respecting food sovereignty, respecting those who are living with and are close to the land. So you again get a kind of distancing through technology and control. So that's not a precise answer about genetic engineering, but it's some of the routes around which I think those kinds of technologies can lead us.
And always worth reiterating the message that the science and the technology don't exist in isolation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got time for one quick question right at the end. Thank you. Are you still keen?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask something a bit more to do with communication. Obviously, soils are something that we don't see, so I think there's less of a space for them in conservation. But I was wondering how we could kind of advocate for soils and, really put them forward without encoding ideas of like human goodness and badness, or how much they serve humans, and just in terms of like what the future of communication with soils could look like there.
I did not plant this question, but this is an excellent question to finish on. Thank you so much. How do we spread the soil positive word amongst the people?
Yeah.
You are the messiahs.
Okay.
Tell your disciples what they should go out and do.
Storytelling is very important because we're trying to explore and imagine a space that we have no way to experience with our own unaided senses. And so that's one of the reasons why artists, the arts, are very, very important in this arena. And one of the reasons why talking about soil is so particularly fascinating. And it's also one of the reasons why taking an interest, building bridges with, forming alliance with communities, with traditional knowledge systems and knowledge holders about how soil is understood. I've been doing this with an Ecuadorian people called the Sarayaku people, and went there to study the fungi there, to help them develop a fungal wing to an already very powerful multi-decade campaign against drilling and mining their territory. And we learned a lot from each other by talking about how we imagined the soil. And so my summary answer would be story in the broadest possible sense as the best way to engage our imaginations and our feelings.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got a bit more time for, real quick, yeah?
I would say we need to switch the narrative towards understanding and talking about soils as more than human cultures and as our kin. So we're thinking about mutual interdependence. We're understanding, thinking about, advocating for soils as if they were our mothers or our sisters or our brothers, not as something not as a service, not as something we mine or extract from, or even bank or invest in. So culture and kinship, and then we're in a different place. And we can advocate just in the way we'd advocate for human purposes. We're talking then about more than human purposes, in which we're all deeply embroiled.
I think another aspect of it really is in terms of biodiversity. Biodiversity, I think, is a concept that's increasingly recognised. People are concerned about it, but they perhaps haven't really thought about how soils encapsulate that sort of concept and the rich life that exists in soils. I mean, earthworms are a wonderful example, really. We talked about cutting up earthworms in excavations, but there are so many earthworms there, it doesn't really matter that one or two. Anyway, they reproduce when you cut them up.
Let me just rescue that from potential causes for the killing of earthworms.
Don't kill them.
Go and, the more you encourage me, the more I make these jokes. Go forth and be the dirt you want to see in the world. And please join me in thanking our amazing panel, Merlin Sheldrake, Melissa Leach, and Martin Bell. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and joining us.